Have you ever bought one of these? I'm sure you've at least seen them. This is not a GTX 1050 Ti, and you'd be silly to think so. I remember these popping up back in 2017, and I've always wanted one, mostly to show people what's wrong with them and how to detect a fake card. Recently I saw them pop back up and they're still being marketed as a 1050 Ti, selling at the same price while giving you much worse performance. Why does this matter? What's the difference? How can you tell? And what actually are these? What I would hate is for anyone to buy one of these expecting playable performance and instead getting something that can't run anything after 2017. The first red flag is this shroud. There are a few, but most of them look like this with the green and sometimes blue accents. The next telltale sign is VGA. Pascal cards, Nvidia's 10 series, do not have VGA. I had someone selling one of these tell me the exact opposite, but I have yet to find any information backing up that claim. Next inconsistency is SLI. 10 series from Nvidia killed SLI. The only cards you'll find this on is 1070 and above. Not all these fake cards have SLI, but if you see the connector, it's not a 1050 Ti. This next difference isn't a defining feature, but a GTX 1050 Ti has a TDP of 75 watts, which is the same as the power delivery that the PCI Express slot gives you. So there isn't a requirement for a 6-pin power connector, which would give you another 75 watts to play with. There are still like 8 1050 Ti's with a 6-pin, like the MSI Gaming X variant, but for the most part, it's not necessary. So seeing a 6-pin on a non-high-end version, I mean, look at the shroud, is something to keep in mind. You can also examine the back of the card and compare it to a real 1050s. You can kind of see the difference. Another nitpick is that dishonest cards will likely describe their memory on their sticker with DDR5 rather than the very necessary and correct GDDR5. Finally, the only way to figure out what these cards actually are is to take off the heatsink, clean the thermal paste, and read the die. These fake cards are most of the time GTX 550 Ti, aka GF116, an entry-level card from 2011. There are other fake cards, such as supposedly GTX 960s and 750 Ti's that could be GTS 450s, GTX 550 Ti like this one, and I believe I've also seen GTX 650s. When you get one of these cards, they usually come with a driver disk. This one came with some GeForce driver 382.33, which is a 2017 driver for Fermi, the architecture for the GTX 400 and 500 series cards. These listings do also sometimes point out that you need this particular disk and driver for the card to work, but that's only because the real 1050 Ti driver won't. Thankfully, the latest driver for these cards, 391.35, works, but yeah, it would be sus if the ones selling and shipping these cards were flat out marketing these as 1050 Ti's, but also point out that you would need to use a Fermi driver. My main gripe with these cards is how they claim to have a 4GB frame buffer of GDDR5 memory. DDR5. While the 550 Ti does have GDDR5, it's usually only 1GB and up to 2GB in capacity. I always like to show off these cards when I can. I have two EVGA GTX 550 Ti's that each have 2GB of memory, so these are some of the best ones you can get. But back to the fake. Saying it has 4GB is one thing, but that's only because it's been flashed to read otherwise. GPUZ does point out this is a fake card while not actually knowing what it is. The information that is here is correct, but some info like shader clock and memory size is absent. I'm not certain, but there are 8 of these Alpedia chips, and I'm fairly certain this is a 1GB card, but I could be wrong. Also, when comparing the specs of this card to other 550 Ti's, it's interesting how this card's core clock is 750 MHz, while an honest 550 Ti's base clock is typically 900 MHz. So this fake card is clocked 20% lower than stock for some reason. Thankfully, it can overclock just fine to stock speeds, and bumping its core memory clock up by 20% actually yielded 20% higher performance. That's great! I mean, I only tested GTA 5, Tomb Raider 2013, and Doom 2016 because 1, I don't have a bunch of games, and 2, this card can't really run modern games. You're missing DirectX 12 and Vulkan support, and with only 1GB of actual VRAM, not to mention over the last 10 years, well, it's not gotten any faster. I ran these tests at 900p with an i7-6700K at stock speeds, with 16GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory. Now I'd like to restore this to its former 550 Ti glory, and stop misleading software and VRAM counts with this BS. So thankfully, TechPowerUp has a collection of VBIOS and flashing tools, so I just found a reasonable clone of this card, something with only a 900 MHz core and a non-crazy memory clock with a similar BIOS version. It's interesting how this is this card's BIOS version, and while there are 5 cards that have the same BIOS version except for the last 2 zeros at the end, so I can actually choose one that match fairly well, and I have no idea how to flash NVIDIA BIOS with this tool. I've done AMD cards, like when flashing a 480 or 470 to a 580 or 570, or at least this was the plan until I actually started trying to flash it. Apparently it's not that easy. It seems through the many forum posts I saw, while the general advice wasn't great, but the only way to save it seems to be a physical device to flash the VBIOS and editing a hex editor, and I can't quite do that right now. I've also heard hints toward Elpida memory being a red flag and generally worse. It's also possible that this memory configuration could prevent this card from being fixed, and this card does crash fairly often. It was kinda hard to get those benchmarks. It's a neat relic if you get one for nearly $0, but it won't get you very far. It's full of bugs with the probably fake 4GB. But again, I do have 2 real GTX 550 Ti's, and I wanted to see how it compared to its identity crisis-ridden brother. So, after the same tests with the real 550 Ti, the results are a little surprising. Yes, the real one is faster, but by only about 10%, which happens to be the same increase on the memory clock compared to the fake one. I'm intrigued by the linear scaling of performance and clock speeds. The real card did get hotter, but not unreasonably hot.
I decided to test out a couple more cards for perspective. The 1050 Ti's little brother, the GT 1030, and most of you know this card is incredibly efficient, but also not very fast. It should also be noted that this is a 2GB GDDR5 variant and not the slower DDR4 version. I also have an R9 380 4GB, and this card is within spitting distance of a real 1050 Ti, and should put the rest of these cards into perspective. I also unboxed and cleaned this card in my last video, which you should check out in a minute. Lastly, I threw in a GTX 660, a 2GB card that's definitely better than the 550 Ti, but also very slow and outdated today. All of these cards, even the wimpy 1030, puts the 550 Ti's to shame while drawing a fraction of the power and generating much less heat and noise. The 660 even does a bit better than the 1030, but keep in mind a 660 is very old and unsupported these days, and much less efficient than the 1030. But so is the R9 380, but given the performance, I would consider something in this performance range, i.e. a real 1050 Ti-ish, to be the minimum for today, like bare minimum. It depends on the games you're playing, but as long as it's not newer titles, the R9 380 4GB holds its own, surpasses all of these other cards, and given the prices of the used market, all of these cards should be close enough in price to where it wouldn't cost much more to get a lot more performance. And it's not far off in price from getting something even like an RX 480 or 580, which would be much better than these. Exploring these old and unsupported cards is something I enjoy, and if you do as well, then be sure to get subscribed. But back to the fake 1050 Ti.
If you have the proper tools to flash this fake card back in a real one, it may be worth it, but probably not. Maybe these are meant to live out their lives as a reminder of something?
There's a lesson here, and I'm not the one that's gonna figure it out.
Anyway, the days of 1050 Ti being a good entry-level mid-range card are over, but I wouldn't be surprised if the real 1050 Ti's would end up being flashed to read as GTX 5050 when the time comes, and there will be people falling for it just the same. If you happen to be looking for a used card, a good deal is any reputable board partner version of something last gen from AMD, such as a 5700 XT or maybe even an RTX 2070. If you can find either of those for just over or under $100, that's a good deal. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, bye. Oh yeah, and check out Patreon, you can pay me some microtransaction money, woo!